Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where I have the pleasure of speaking to you. My name is ScottClausen with PPM Works, and today I'll be presenting on automating business process with project server workflows. It's a pleasure to present at this first Project Virtual Conference, and I appreciate your attention. A little bit about PPM Works. So we are a Microsoft certified gold partner in the project portfolio management space. We pride ourselves on quality of service, trusted experience that runs deep, starting back with Project Central in the year 2001. Listening, having a proven methodology and set of templates to get you started quickly, and also cost competitiveness. You can see we've served clients across a wide variety of industries. So for today's session, I reviewed the agenda for Project Virtual Conference. I believe this is the only workflow, detail workflow related session. So I want to give it its due and really provide you a end-to-end overview of how to implement project server workflows in your organization. And along the way, there'll be tips, whether you're a novice user just getting started with workflow or an advanced. I think there'll be a few things in here that will be new to you, new items to learn. For example, there are some new workflow actions that just came out this past summer, those being bulk update fields, custom fields, and creating project sites from workflow. So we'll cover those. I have a 5-part agenda. We'll begin with some introduction to workflows, the business background behind workflows, and then go through kind of a 4-step process for building workflows, planning and designing, configuring the project web app, the building workflows, which will be really about half of this presentation, and then publishing and testing your workflows with some time for question and answer in the live session. So let's get into it. Why should your organization consider project online or project server workflows? Well, there's actually some simple reasons. Some of our customers aren't even thinking about workflows, but they ask us, is there a way to send email notice when a project's complete, or maybe after a certain point in a project? You can accomplish that with workflows. Another very simple reason is you can require fields. Maybe you have a field like project sponsor that you want to require, but maybe it's only required for certain departments. Well, you're not able to do that unless you implement workflows that then give you the department level required fields. Another very simple but valuable reason for workflows. Last simple reason is to improve performance. Microsoft stated that, for example, the creation of project sites at the very beginning of the project slows the initial project creation. It also adds maybe a lot more project sites than you'd need if projects aren't approved to advance further. Another great reason for, simple reason for workflows. And then when we think about the advanced reasons, some of the business impact, if you'd like to implement demand management, that is the ability to centrally create your project ideas, filter through those ideas, score those ideas, and just progress the ideas that are most valuable to the organization. Another reason is to transition from informal to formal portfolio governance. Maybe today, projects are selected based on who has the loudest voice in the organization. There's not a clear process for selection. Implementing a workflow around that governance will formalize it. And really, if you think about workflows, they raise the organizational commitment to portfolio management. People have to approve. They're receiving emails about approvals or rejections. People know at any one point where projects are in your portfolio lifecycle. So it really raises the level of commitment to portfolio management in your organization. So what are some of the components you need to get started with workflow? Well, the first and foremost is business process understanding. We want to understand what types of projects you have in your organization. How are those projects identified? Are they people's ideas? Do they come from customers? Do they come from executives? How do they flow through your portfolio lifecycle process? So that's important to have. Then on the technical side, of course, you're going to need Project Online or Project Server 2013. The workflows I'll be addressing today are all features that are available in either one of these tools. And lastly, the actual design tool that you'll use will be SharePoint Designer 2013, which is a free download. That's the recommended tool. But if you'd like, really not much feature difference, you can also use Visual Studio 2013. So when we talk about, there's a section in here where we're going to talk about the project web app configurations for workflows. And there's quite a lot of these involved. And on the left here, I show that the project web app configurations you have begin with something called enterprise project types. Inside those, you're going to have phases and stages for your projects. You're able to present project detail pages, which are the form pages for projects, depending on what stage or phase they're in. And then on those pages, you have web parts with what are called custom fields. So I've said this before in other presentations. I like to consider workflows kind of the final exam topic for Project Server, Project Online, because you have to have this understanding. So if all of these items are new to you, never heard of any of these PWA configurations here on the left, you can hang with me, but really you're going to have to get a solid understanding of these first, and I really don't have time just based on the workflow focus to cover all these things in today's presentation. So you have the components, you're ready to get started for workflow. Good news is if you're using Project Online, workflows are ready to build and get started with out of the box, nothing you need to do. If you have Project Server 2013, you want to have a look at this TechNet article here, and there's a few basic steps you need. You need to install and configure something called the Workflow Manager, and then you need to configure Workflow Manager to work with SharePoint Server, your SharePoint Server 2013 form. Once done with those steps, or even if you're using Project Online, you can bring up SharePoint Designer, go to create a new workflow. If you see the SharePoint 2013 workflow Project Server available in SharePoint Designer, you know that everything in your environment is ready to go. So next we're going to go through a 4-step process for creating workflows in your organization, beginning with plan and design, the configure PWA, which, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not going to go into detail of those steps, building a workflow, where we'll spend most of the time talking about some tips and best practices, and then lastly, briefly, just publishing and testing your workflows. Let's jump into plan and design. So it all really begins with whiteboarding, or essentially identifying your business process. And workflows in Project Online, Project Server are organized in portfolio phases at the top level and stages. So what I like to do with my customers is whiteboard it. I list, for example, here all the phases across the top, and then in blue beneath each of those possible stages of the life cycle. Once on the whiteboard you've mapped those out, you can draw arrows, and then maybe use something like I've done here to talk about where you might have portfolio analysis. That's the strategic selection of projects, where you might want to send emails, where you might have an approval, and then anything maybe you want to asterisk based on something that you have to do based on field selection, moving a project forward based on information that gets filled out, etc. So really, whiteboarding gives you a great tool for sitting in a room of PMO stakeholders, identifying those phases, stages, and the actions in between. So we take that information from the whiteboard and we translate it into Visio. I like the swim lane Visio flowchart, again organizing by phases at the top and then stages within. You can see I have some different symbols here for approvals. I'll also note whenever there's an approval, where does the project go? Does it go back a stage? Does it move forward a stage, etc.? And also add a little icon here to indicate when we're sending email. So this is not, all the details you need to design your workflow, but again, it gives people a basic diagram they can look at, understand, provide feedback, evaluation, etc. Now, one of the tips here I have is really to limit approvals. I can't think of a customer that I've implemented a workflow for and they've come back and said, can you add more approvals? Typically, it's the other way around. We'll go out of the gate with 5 or 6 approvals. They come back in 2 months and say there's way too many. We need to simplify. So keep it simple. Make sure you really need every approval. Remember that when you have an approval, that's going to essentially halt projects in your portfolio lifecycle workflow, and you want to you're going to need someone to approve before they move on. So this is our high-level diagram we got from whiteboarding, and then we're going to use Excel and do some details behind this diagram. So we're going to, in Excel, document what are our phases and stages, and if you want to carry it forward, you can even provide a phase and stage description, and then something called description for submit. That would be what the users see when they want to submit from one stage to the next. As a best practice, we like to begin our phase and stage names with numbers for sorting. The system doesn't have any way of logically sorting phases and stages. When it's presented to the user, they're going to be alphabetical. So it's a great tip to use numbers in front of your phase and stage names. Second thing we're going to document in Excel, I mentioned this briefly as one of the benefits, is where we have required fields. So implementing workflow gives you the ability to have required fields by department, but it also allows you to require fields by your workflow stage. So the example would be projects wouldn't move forward from the idea to proposed stage until they've identified for example, a project sponsor. In addition to required fields in your later stages, maybe when projects are completed or canceled, you can indicate fields would be read-only. And the tip with that is to limit read-only fields. I like to, really not set them to read-only until the very end, just in case they need to be changed, and then users won't be able to change them if they are set read-only. Third thing we're going to document is what are called our project detail pages. So these are the form pages where information on a project is filled out, and you can identify where in the portfolio lifecycle workflow these pages appear, where they become available, and then for certain pages like your strategic impact, which is the project scoring page, you can make it required at a certain phase or stage. So this purpose of this document here is identify where our project detail pages appear and where the certain pages may be required. So the fourth and final area of Excel documentation is going to be the detail of our workflow actions. So what we like to do is list in a simple table here every step in the workflow. So it starts off with going into the idea stage, and you can see I'm going to go over some of these actions here, but there's things like setting stage status. This shows the user what stage the project's in. Waiting for submit. This would be an action where the projects won't advance until the user submits it through the project web app. You can see other things here like approvals and where the approval would go based on a approval versus a rejection, etc. So all this gets documented, and really you're going to take all these Excel documents and bring them in front of your stakeholders for review. And the reason we highly recommend this is that the more you can review with stakeholders, get their buy-in, confirmation, you're going to go in and configure once. You're going to avoid reconfigurations. And as you may know with workflows, when you need to reconfigure, and if you already have projects in those workflows that you reconfigure, you need to restart them. And when you restart a project's workflow, it's like the project is brand new, so you kind of lose the history of when it moved in stage to stage because of the need to restart it. So it's great to get confirmation of your workflows up front. So we've done all that, and now we're going to go into our PWA configuration. And as a review, you're going to go through and configure, based on those Excel documents, what are called enterprise project types. These are the different types of projects you have, maybe simple, complex, long, short, technical, strategic. Those will give you examples of project types. You're going to configure for those project types which phases projects go through in the lifecycle workflow, which stages within those phases, which project detail pages, I said those are the forms, and then which web parts and fields appear on those forms. So all this would be set up before you actually go in and begin building the workflows. And this is just another graphic kind of illustrating how we take the information from Excel and going into the Project Web App settings page, we click different areas to configure this information. Again, beyond the scope of what I'm going to cover today, because I really want to get into the details of building workflows, which is where we're at now. So we've reached step 3 already in our process, build workflows. So to get started, you're going to want to download and install SharePoint Designer 2013. It's a free software tool. And in SharePoint Designer 2013, you're going to go to the Workflows area. And in the Workflows ribbon, click Site Workflow. A dialog window will pop up. And it's really important here that you select the option at the bottom, Platform Type, SharePoint 2013 Workflow Project Server. This is the type of workflow that we'll be using for Project Server workflows. This will take you to what's called the text-based design. And here you'll have an insert ribbon, and you're able to insert. Really, what we recommend is starting by inserting your stages. So you can see here in this example, I've inserted maybe my first 3 stages: concept, business case, and selection. And you want to insert those stages in sequence. If they're out of sequence, you can actually drag them or move them up and down in the design text-based design panel to get them in the correct order. After your stages are in the design panel, there's really 2 areas within these that you'll configure. The first one is an action area, and this occurs kind of in this section above where it says transition to stays. This is your area for actions. So I show a sample action here, such as wait for an event, which is the project is submitted. And then in the lower section of the stage, you're going to have what's called a transition, where you indicate where in the workflow, which stage in the workflow the project goes when it's completed this stage, which an example here is concept. So what are some of the common actions you would use with workflows? The one I just showed you was a wait for when a project is submitted, but you can see some other options there. You can wait for when a project is checked in, and you might repeat this several times throughout the phase or stage. You might wait for when a project is published. That would be a publish from Project Professional. Wait when a project summary information is published. That would be essentially just a save from the Project Web App. You also have another activity here called set the current project stage status. This is one that, it's not required, but it's one that we highly recommend. This is going to give users information about specifically where the project is in the workflow and what's happening next. So we like to use these a lot. I'll talk about that in a moment. So you can tell the user you're waiting for input, waiting for you to submit, or maybe the project just completed the stage, etc. Then on the upper right here, I show that you can also use an action, another common one called a task process. You would use this for approvals. So you get to configure who's going to approve the project, maybe at that stage. Is it multiple approvers? Is it a single? What type of email do they receive when that task is assigned to them? Another thing, common action would be emails. So it gives you a configurable interface for defining who receives the email and what's in it. And the last common action I show here is something called a set variable. So if you want to store information, maybe you want to collect a project cost or a project finish date at a certain point in workflow, you're able to do that using variables. So really the bulk of this presentation, I'm going to go over these 10 tips and best practices. This is what we've learned over the 3+ years of building workflows using SharePoint Designer and this newer tool set. So this will really be of help to you whether you're a novice user or an advanced user. So the first tip we have here is a stage will automatically transition if there is no wait action. So I've been talking about these wait actions, and I just wanted to make the note that if you have a stage, for example, concept here, and concept's going to transition into business case. Well, if I forget to put any wait action here, as the workflow starts, it will go into concept, but there's no wait, so it'll go right into the transition to business case. So even though it's in concept briefly, really by the time the user checks where it's at in the lifecycle workflow, it's going to be all the way into the second stage of business case. So important thing to keep in mind, you need one of these wait events if you want to hold the workflow at a stage. Most commonly you do, but there are some cases where you don't. You'll have maybe just a check for a certain field. If there is that check for a field, then you don't necessarily need a wait. That was tip number 1. Tip number 2, there's a great feature when you're using these workflows for administrators to skip to a workflow stage. So this can happen, maybe you have a number of projects you want to cancel at one time. Maybe there's a bunch of projects in an on hold stage and you want to bring them all the way back to the beginning, kind of skipping them to that early stage. So it's really an important feature. And this may come to a surprise to you, but this feature does not work out of the box. You need to follow this design tip in order for the skip to workflow stage feature to work. The design tip, so I'm showing the skip to workflow stage action here on the left that you'd get in the product, in the project web app. And on the right here, I show how you need to configure each of your workflow stages for this skip action. And inside each stage, what you want to put is a condition. It's not an action, but actually a condition called include this stage. And once you've added it, it looks like this. If Project Web App starts the workflow normally or restarts the workflow, include this stage, it's going to then do everything in this box. So you want to actually add that little section to each stage, and this will allow you to skip into that stage. It's going to read this condition, and it's going to essentially stop or perform whatever is in this block. If you don't have this block, when you try to restart workflows, it's essentially just going to go through the whole workflow until it finishes or reaches some sort of a wait condition. Okay? So really, as a best practice, when we start, I mentioned the first thing we do is add all our stages. The second thing we do is put this condition in each stage. And if you start that way, you'll have it and you'll be able to skip without any issues. Another best practice we like to do is use what's called the set stage status. I mentioned this briefly earlier. This is an action that's going to give users information about what's happening next. This is optional, but it really does provide a lot of good information. And so as a best practice, we like to put these set project stage status actions at the beginning and end of each stage. You can see them highlighted yellow on 2 stages here. So you might just say first when the project enters a stage, you're telling the user submit project to advance, or you can even be more specific, submit project to advance to business case. And then at the end of the stage, again, you might be specific and say concept complete or stage complete. And what this is going to do is it's going to show up in a table on the workflow status page where users are able to see where what's the history of each stage. And when a stage is complete, in the status info, it'll show whatever information you've written as it ends the stage. So use these frequently. Use your stage status notifications at the beginning and end at a minimum. So we were talking about transitions, and I wanted to make a note here that if you have a stage and maybe it's your final stage, as I've shown here, the completed stage, and you're thinking, well, it doesn't really need to transition anywhere, it's done at that point. If you go ahead and try to publish that workflow, it'll give you a warning that the transition cannot be empty. You must have some go-to. Well, the go-to that you need to put in your concluding workflow stage is go to end of workflow. So it's pretty safe. They won't let you actually publish the workflow until you have this. You don't want to go back to another stage at the end. You want to go to the end, and that will actually tell SharePoint that the workflow is completed and you've reached the end of the workflow. And this is a required transition. Okay, the next tip is a special one, and this will be one I think if you are an advanced user that will you'll appreciate. So pretty commonly we'll have customers ask us to include what we call cancel or on hold stages. So these are just a stage where you want to maybe end the workflow, but it's not completed, it's actually canceled. So instead of going to completed, the workflow will need to go to canceled. And what you need to do in this case, so I show below here a canceled stage. We like to put these after our completed stage. So you'd have your normal completed stage followed by a canceled. Now, in the completed stage, just like I showed you on the previous slide, you're going to end with a end of workflow. However, there's a special configuration for cancel. Because you actually have a canceled stage that occurs last here, you want to add this condition, that same condition we looked at earlier, the if Project Web App starts the workflow normally or restarts the workflow includes this stage, you're going to put that right in your transition area with the end of workflow on the top, and then for the else condition going to your canceled stage. What this allows you to do is to move projects using the skip feature into the canceled stage. If you don't have this information, this condition here, when you try to skip projects to canceled, they'll just actually stop incompleted because it reaches the end of workflow without a condition here. So put that condition down in transition. Now, because canceled is my last stage and there's nothing after that, I don't need the condition down here. So that's a great tip to allow you to have canceled stages in your workflow. One of the common events or actions you might want is the ability to set a project field. And I actually show that down here. So in this case, maybe I have a requirement to set my overall status field in the project to green. No problem. However, you must check in the project before this action. And there's really two ways to do that. If you're in the Project Web App and you're configuring your stage, you are able to select for that stage that project check-in is required. When a project enters a stage where check-in is required, the application will actually check the project in, and this gives you a great opportunity to set fields right when a project enters that stage. And that's really kind of how the project check-in is required feature works at the beginning of a stage. If you want to set a field later in the stage, what you'll need to do is use that wait for event. Here I'm showing a wait for event action where I'm waiting for the project to check in the workflow, and then I can set the overall status or any other field I needed to in my project. Next tip, sending emails from workflow. This is one where we commonly have requests for this, and to be honest, it's one of the areas we really find a lot of issues. It seems like it's not consistent. Now, Project Online, it's going to be consistent customer to customer, but when we're working with Project Server 2013 on-prem, it seems like it works differently in every organization. So here's just a few tips that you want to think about when you're trying to send email from workflow. One of them is that when you are sending email to the project owner, you can go and choose the project owner email as one of your project data fields. You want to use that. Don't try to use the project owner name. Actually use the owner email when you're sending email. Next thing is if you're trying to send email based on some project field, you want to make sure the username values match Exchange. So if you're configuring a list of values, you're going to have to make sure the names there match Exchange. If you're really still having trouble at that point, kind of an advanced workaround is you can actually build a list in SharePoint For example, I might create one called requesters, and just go ahead and list all the emails of the requesters. And then when I'm trying to send an email to them, I can actually look up their name in that list using this workflow feature and send to their email that I've configured in the list. So that's kind of a last resort option there if you're having trouble sending email from workflows. So let's say you have an approval and you want to send an email based on rejection or approval. The way you want to do this is actually create a condition set in your workflow. So here I have a task process for PMO approval. Once that task process is done, I'm going to put a condition set in here where if the approval equals approved, I'm going to send my approval email. Otherwise, or I can say if the business case approval equals rejected, then we're going to send our rejection email. So you put this condition set here, and the reason I want to point this out, I'm calling a repeat condition set, is because you also are going to use this down here on the transition. So it's used on the transition to determine which stage you go to, but it's used up here in the action set to send emails. So you kind of repeat it twice. Once up here to send the email, the second time in the transition to determine which stage you want to go to next. Okay, I believe we're on our 8th tip now. Something you might want to include in advanced portfolio lifecycle workflows is the ability to move forward in the workflow based on portfolio selection. So if you're using the portfolio analysis feature, you know that you can come through, analyze, for example, projects based on a cost or resource constraint. The example I'm showing here is based on a cost constraint. There's a good MSDN article about how the values in the application are stored based on someone either forcing in a project, forcing it out, just regularly having a selection on it, or regularly not having a selection. So there's really 4 cases. Is it forced in? Is it forced out? Is it selected by default, or not selected by default, or selected by default? And those give you 3 values here. And typically, if you're going to look to approve or advance a project based on portfolio selection, you're going to want to advance it if it's been forced in, or if it's selected by default. And that would be case 0 and case 3 here. So all we do is create a simple variable, and we look for optimizer decision equals 0. Then we set our variable to 1. Otherwise, another condition might be if the decision equals 3, then we also set our variable to 1. So this gives you a way to set a variable based on whether or not the project was selected in portfolio analysis. And then from here, you can advance it to the right stage, advance it back a stage, send an email, etc. Our last tip here is as you're building your workflows, one of the best practices is to back them up frequently. And there's no real native way to back up workflows. So we like to use the export to Visio feature. So you'll find that in SharePoint Designer. And what you want to do is export those workflows, really before you make any major change. That way, if something went wrong, you have the ability to restore rather than just repair your workflow. And we have noticed that if you have some of these advanced conditions, such as the one around canceled that I showed, when you try to import back from Visio restore, it may not import directly into the text designer. It'll essentially just show you the graphical Visio designer. In order to get it back into text, you may have to look for places where your stages have become broken and use the connection toolbar to join those. So good, that was our last tip. So just to kind of review all these tips, we talked about the fact that you need a transition action. You need a wait action to stop at a stage. We talked about the best practice for configuring for the skip to workflow stage feature. Set a project stage status at the beginning and end of each stage. Making sure you include that transition to your end of workflow at the end. We showed you a little special configuration for setting up cancel stages at the end. making sure you check in the project before attempting to set any project field, a few tips around sending email from workflows, how you set a repeat condition for approval emails, including a portfolio selection condition, and lastly, the Visio for backup. So before we move on from build, I did want to talk about two new actions available. These were released early summer for Project Online and actually just recently in August, late summer for Project Server 2013 on-prem. And one of these is called Bulk Update Custom Fields. So before this, previously, you really had to update one field at a time, and that was really time-consuming. Update, save, update, save, update, save. Meanwhile, the user is waiting for the workflow to catch up while it's doing all those update project fields. So now we have the ability to update several fields at once. And I represent this just on one slide with a link to the MSDN article. It provides more details, but generally the process is, as I mentioned earlier, you need to wait for the project to be checked in. You build what's called a workflow dictionary object to store they're going to be HTTP header requests, just some built-in fields when you're doing HTTP requests. You're going to build a second dictionary that defines all the fields you want to update for the project. Then you're going to go ahead and check out the project. You're going to call this HTTP update custom fields method. It's going to pass the header and the two dictionaries that you defined. Once that finishes, you want to go ahead and publish the project so the information is visible and check it in so other users can check it out. So this is somewhat of an advanced workflow action, but really would be an important one if you're trying to set more than one field at a time on a project in a workflow action. One note here at the bottom is I went through and tested this MSDN article. I found that there was actually an error, and I highlighted when you're actually referring to the URL of the project site. I believe it should look like this on the bottom of the screen, not what they have in the MSDN article. Second action is one called Create Project Site. So as you may know, when a project is created in the Project Web App, you can set it up once it's published or first created to automatically create the project site. A project site is going to store your project collateral documents as well as allow you to record issues and risks against the project, and it further supports team member collaboration. So Microsoft really recommends this in workflow because postponing project site creation can significantly improve the performance of creating a project. So when you first create a project, you don't have to wait for the site to be created. That's going to speed up performance. And if you are, for example, bringing just proposed or idea projects into your environment, maybe those projects don't advance further from that initial stage. So there's really no point in taking up resources of the system, creating a project site for them if they're not going to move forward. So that's where this workflow action is a great option to define when project sites are created in the workflow. And for this, you will follow a similar step. You'll essentially, first thing you need to do is go into the Project Web App, allow users to set a setting to allow users to choose when their sites are created. You'll build, again, a dictionary of the header request fields, and then call the action to create the project site. Unlike the previous action we looked at, you don't need to wait for the project to be checked in. This one you can do at any time. It's a little easier, a little shorter here in the steps. Well, we've made it to the end. We have our full workflow ready in SharePoint Designer. So at that point, you're going to want to publish. It will show up any errors you might have when you attempt to publish. You'll need to fix those in SharePoint Designer. And then when we talk about testing, what we like to do is go back to our Visio diagram here and pay particular attention to all these condition results. Every time you have an approval, yes, no, you want to set up a test case for testing both the rejection and the approval and go through those methodically so you know the workflow is behaving the way you would expect. Does it allow me to reject? After rejection, can I then approve, etc.? And as you are troubleshooting workflows, and you go to what's called the workflow status page in the project web app, this is the page that will show you where you're at in workflow. At the bottom right of this page, it's kind of easy to miss. There is a link for additional workflow data. And this will take you to a page that shows more details on why a project may or may not be working in workflow. And when you go to that page, you're able to, in your workflow, here's another action that I didn't talk about, create what are called workflow, an action to log workflow history. Here you can record text. For example, the one I show here is text on workflow started, so that when I then go to that page in my workflow, it will record the history for me and show me as the workflow has been progressing, what text, what logs did I make to the workflow history log. So if you're really having trouble, you can log different points of your workflow. That helps you identify how far the workflow progressed, or you can even write your variables into this area so you can read those variables. And then above this workflow history, you're able to see a graphic that shows the internal status of the workflow. So this will say in progress, or when a workflow completes, it'll say completed, or when there's an issue like the one I'm showing here, it'll show up as suspended with a little information icon. If you click that, particularly in Project Online, this is helpful because it gives you the details of why the workflow crashed. And this is really, for Project Online, your only area to review details on workflow crashes. So the two tips here as you're troubleshooting are use the log to workflow history, and then come to the workflow additional workflow data page and check for any suspended workflows, what messages you might have. So that really wraps it up. We made it through our 4 stages: plan design, configure PWA, building a workflow, and lastly, publishing and testing. So I hope this information and session was valuable to you. I'll provide a few additional resources here. These are some of the previous articles written on workflows. There's great information out on, it's really kind of the definitive guide called The Hitchhiker's Guide to Demand Management in Project Server 2013. There's also information out on Channel 9 videos from the project conference, as well as if you happen to be a MPUG, Microsoft Project Users Group member, I did actually an 8-hour session on workflows where I go into a lot more detail than today. I appreciate your time, and you all have a great day.